I wasn't expecting you to become something I couldn't simply put aside. At first, there was nothing remarkable about it. No dramatic beginning, no moment that announced itself as important. Nothing that should have made me stop and question why your presence felt different from everyone else. You were simply there, and somehow, that was enough. I've always been good at keeping people at a distance without making them feel distant. There are layers to me that most people never reach, not because I deliberately hide them, but because I've learned that not everything needs to be explained. People usually see what I give them. They notice the words, the reactions, the visible parts of me. They create their own conclusions from those pieces and move on, believing they understand. I've never corrected them. It was easier that way. Until you started noticing the things I never said, not in an obvious way. You didn't question every silence or turn every small reaction into a conversation. You simply noticed, and that was different. You noticed when my words meant less than my silence. You noticed when I pulled back without actually leaving. You noticed the difference between what I said and what I was actually thinking. I remember realizing it for the first time. You responded to something I hadn't explained, not because you guessed, because somehow you understood the space around it. That stayed with me. I didn't say anything, but I noticed, and once I noticed, I started noticing everything else. The way you listened without preparing your response, the way you could sit with uncertainty without immediately trying to solve it, the way you never seemed uncomfortable with the parts of me that other people usually tried to soften. You didn't ask me to become easier to understand. You didn't need me to explain every contradiction. You simply allowed me to be exactly as complicated as I was. That should have made me comfortable. Instead, it made me cautious. Because being understood is not always comforting. Sometimes it is frightening, especially when you've spent years becoming difficult to read. There is safety in being misunderstood. People can only reach the version of you they believe exists. They can judge it, admire it, misunderstand it, even walk away from it. But, but they never reach the deeper structure underneath. You somehow got closer without trying, and I didn't know what to do with that. I kept telling myself it was coincidence, that maybe we simply noticed similar things, that maybe the moments that felt strangely precise were nothing more than timing. But coincidence has limits. It doesn't keep appearing in the same places. It doesn't repeatedly arrive through silence, through small expressions, through things that were never spoken. Eventually, I had to admit that something was happening. Not necessarily something I could name, but something I could recognize. And recognition has its own kind of certainty. It doesn't need proof in the way logic does. It simply arrives. You began appearing in my thoughts in places where I hadn't invited you, not constantly, not obsessively, just naturally. A thought would form, and somehow I would already know how you might see it. Something would happen, and part of me would instinctively consider your perspective. I started wondering what you would notice, what you would understand, what you would leave unsaid. That was when I realized the difference. I wasn't simply thinking about you. Your presence had started influencing the way I thought. And that was new, because I have always trusted my own internal world. I've built it carefully. I know how to process things alone. I know how to step back, analyze, detach, and return when I've made sense of something. But you introduced something I couldn't categorize. Another perspective without another voice, another presence without physical closeness, a kind of silent reference point. And the strange thing was, I didn't resent it. I should have. I should have protected the boundaries I had spent so long maintaining. Instead, I became curious about was happening. I started watching the connection instead of resisting it. And maybe that was the first real mistake, because once you stop fighting something, you give it room to grow. And this grew quietly. There was no announcement, no agreement, no moment where either of us decided that something had changed. It simply became different. The conversations carried more weight, the silences became less empty. Small moments started feeling like they contained information, and I began understanding something I hadn't expected to understand. You didn't need constant access to affect me. You didn't need to be present every moment. You didn't need to ask for a place in my life. Somehow, you had already created one, and I couldn't tell you exactly when it happened. That bothered me. I like knowing when something changes. I like knowing why. I like being able to trace the beginning of a decision back to a specific moment. With you, there was no beginning I could point to. There was only a gradual realization that something had already changed. And perhaps that was why it felt so powerful. Nothing had been forced. Nothing had been demanded. Nothing had been taken. I had simply allowed something to exist. And now I was beginning to understand what that meant. Because when you allow someone to exist inside your thoughts without constantly correcting their position, they stop feeling temporary. They become part of the internal landscape. You begin making room for them without realizing you're doing it. And once that space exists, removing them isn't as simple as deciding to create distance. That is what I hadn't anticipated. I thought distance could solve anything. I thought if something became too complicated, I could step back. If something became too meaningful, I could create boundaries. If something threatened the structure I had built, I could dismantle it before it became permanent. But you weren't threatening my structure. You were revealing it. You were showing me parts of myself that became visible only because someone else recognized them. And that distinction changed everything. Maybe that's why I never truly wanted to leave, even when I questioned it, even when I told myself I should create space, even when I wondered whether I was allowing something to become more important than it needed to be. Some part of me already knew the answer. I wasn't trying to escape you. I was trying to understand why I didn't want to. And the more I searched for an explanation, the clearer it became. You weren't demanding anything from me. You weren't trying to possess my attention. You weren't asking me to become someone different. You simply existed in a way that made me feel less misunderstood, without requiring me to explain myself. That kind of presence is rare, and rare things are difficult to ignore. So I stopped pretending this was ordinary. I stopped reducing every moment to coincidence. I stopped telling myself that eventually the feeling of recognition would disappear, because it didn't. If anything, it became quieter, deeper, more certain. And perhaps that was the most unsettling part. It wasn't getting louder, it was becoming undeniable. I still don't know what name belongs to this. Maybe it doesn't need one yet. Maybe some connections lose their meaning when you rush to define them. But I know this much. Something in me shifted when you appeared. And whatever existed before that moment is not exactly where I live anymore. I can return to old places, old habits, old ways of thinking. But I can't return with the same mind, because now I know what it feels like to be recognized without having to explain. And once you experience that kind of understanding, you don't forget it. I thought understanding you would make this easier. It didn't. If anything, The more I began to understand what was happening between us, the less I knew what to do with it, because there is a certain comfort in uncertainty. When you don't know what something means, you can leave it alone. You can tell yourself it's temporary. You can convince yourself that time will eventually explain everything. But understanding removes that excuse. And I was beginning to understand. Not everything, not the future, not what this connection was supposed to become, but enough to know that it mattered. That was the part I couldn't ignore anymore. You had become part of the way I experienced certain moments. Something would happen, and before I could fully process it, I would wonder how you would see it. A conversation would happen, and I would catch myself thinking about what you might have noticed beneath the words. A silence would appear, and instead of feeling empty, it would somehow feel familiar, almost shared. That shouldn't have been possible. Yet somehow it was. And the more it happened, the more I realized that your influence wasn't coming from what you said. It was coming from what you didn't say. You had never tried to convince me of anything. You had never tried to become important. You had never asked for a place in my thoughts. You simply left impressions behind, small ones, almost invisible, but they accumulated, and eventually I could feel their weight. That's how people become significant sometimes, not by demanding attention, by becoming impossible to overlook. I started noticing how different I was around you. I wasn't performing, I wasn't calculating, I wasn't deciding which version of myself would be easiest to understand. I could simply respond. And that sounds ordinary until you've spent years making sure nobody gets the unfiltered version of you. There is a difference between being honest and being unguarded. I've always been capable of honesty. I can tell the truth. I can explain what I think. I can admit what I know and what I don't. But being unguarded is different. Being unguarded means you don't think about how your truth will be received before you allow it to exist. Around you, that started happening. Not completely, not all at once, but enough. And every time it happened, I noticed. I began asking myself, why? Why you? Why this? Why now? Why did someone I barely had enough history with feel more familiar than people I had known for years? I didn't have an answer, and normally that would have been enough for me to step away, but I didn't. Instead, I stayed curious. That was unusual. I don't usually stay near things I can't explain. I either understand them or I create enough distance that they no longer matter. But distance wasn't working with you. I could step away physically. I could become quieter. I could focus on other things. I could convince myself that nothing had changed, but the internal shift remained. And that taught me something. Distance doesn't always create separation. Sometimes it only makes you more aware of what remains after someone is gone. You remained. That was the problem. Even when there was no conversation, there was still awareness. Even when nothing happened, something continued. I began to understand that your presence wasn't dependent on proximity anymore. It had become internal. And that is a difficult place for someone to reach, because once someone becomes part of your internal world, you can't simply ask them to leave. There is no door, no clear boundary, no switch. You can only decide how much attention you give it, and I tried giving it less. It didn't work, not because I was obsessed, not because I couldn't think about anything else, but because ignoring something doesn't make it disappear. It only makes you aware that you're ignoring it. So, eventually, I stopped fighting the awareness. I let myself observe it. I let myself notice what was changing. And what I discovered surprised me. You weren't making me weaker. You weren't taking something away from me. You weren't becoming a replacement for anything I already had. You were simply making certain parts of me more visible, the parts I had become comfortable keeping hidden, the parts that didn't need fixing, the parts that didn't need explanation, the parts that simply wanted to exist without being interpreted incorrectly. Maybe that was why your presence felt different. You didn't seem interested in creating a version of me that made sense to you. You seemed interested in understanding the version that already existed. That's rare. Most people listen for something they can respond to. You seem to listen for what was underneath the response. Most people look at behavior. You noticed intention. Most people hear words. You noticed patterns. And I began wondering whether you were doing it intentionally. Maybe you were, maybe you weren't. I still don't know, but I know what it did to me. It made me more aware of myself. And awareness can be uncomfortable when you've spent years moving through life automatically. I started catching myself in moments I would normally overlook. I noticed why I withdrew, why certain things bothered me, why some conversations exhausted me while others didn't, why I trusted silence more than explanation, why I preferred being understood quietly rather than questioned loudly. You didn't teach me these things. You simply made them impossible for me to ignore. And perhaps that is what real recognition does. It doesn't give you a new identity. It reveals the one you were already carrying. That's why I stopped thinking of this as something you created. You didn't create the connection. You uncovered it. You didn't put something inside me. You made me aware of something that had been there unnoticed. And that changed the way I looked at everything. Because if you could recognize something in me without being told it existed, then maybe there was something in you that felt equally familiar. Maybe that's why the connection never felt like one person reaching toward another. It felt more like two people discovering that they had been standing on similar ground all along, different lives, different histories, different experiences, but similar ways of seeing, similar ways of processing, similar ways of becoming quiet when something mattered too much to say. That similarity was what made this difficult, because attraction can be explained, circumstance can be explained, timing can be explained, but recognition without history? That leaves you with fewer explanations. And I don't like having fewer explanations. I like certainty. I like knowing what something is before I give it significance. But with you, certainty came in a different form. I couldn't define the connection, but I could recognize its effect. I couldn't predict where it would lead, but I could see what it had already changed. And perhaps that was enough, because sometimes certainty isn't knowing what happens next. Sometimes certainty is knowing that something has already happened, and something had. You had changed the way I noticed people. You had changed the way I listened. You had changed the way I understood silence. You had changed the standard by which I measured certain forms of connection. Not because you were perfect, not because you were everything I had ever wanted, but because you reached me without trying to, and that matters. There is something powerful about a person who doesn't need to convince you of their presence. They simply become part of the room, part of the atmosphere, part of the thought you didn't realize you were having. That's what happened. You became familiar without becoming predictable, close without becoming demanding, important without becoming controlling, and somehow that balance made me trust the connection more. I began realizing that I wasn't afraid of you. I was afraid of what your presence revealed about me, because it showed me that I was capable of letting someone matter. I had spent so long believing that independence meant never needing anyone to understand me. But perhaps independence isn't the absence of connection. Perhaps it's the ability to choose connection without losing yourself inside it. And around you, I didn't feel smaller. I felt more precise, more aware, more honest. That is why I couldn't simply dismiss what was happening. Whatever this becomes, whatever it doesn't become, something has already changed. And I think I'm finally ready to admit that. Not to you, not yet, maybe not even completely to myself, but enough to stop pretending that this is nothing. Because it isn't nothing. It may not have a name. It may not have a direction. It may not have a conclusion. But it has presence. And presence is enough to change things. The strange part is that I no longer feel the need to force an answer. For once, I don't want to rush toward a definition. I don't want to turn something rare into something ordinary just because ordinary things are easier to understand. Maybe this needs room. Maybe it needs time. Maybe the next step isn't deciding what it is. Maybe the next step is simply accepting that it exists. And if I am honest with myself, that's what I've already done. I've stopped resisting it. I've I've stopped pretending I don't notice. I've stopped trying to reduce it to coincidence. And now that I've stopped fighting the awareness, I can finally see what has been happening all along. You didn't enter my world loudly. You didn't demand to be noticed. You didn't ask to become important. You simply became someone whose presence made certain truths impossible to ignore. And perhaps that's why I keep coming back to the same realization. I didn't choose to notice you, but somewhere along the way, I chose not to look away. There comes a moment, you stop asking whether something is real and start asking what you're willing to do about the fact that it is. I think I'm getting close to that moment. For a long time, I treated this like something I could simply observe, something interesting, something unusual, something I didn't need to define because it wasn't demanding anything from me. That was easier as long as I could call it awareness. I didn't have to admit how deeply it had reached. As long as I could describe it as recognition, I didn't have to consider what recognition might eventually require. But there is a limit to observation. Eventually, you realize that you're not standing outside the experience anymore. You're inside it. And that's where I am now. Somewhere along the way, you stopped being a question I was trying to understand. You became part of the answer to questions I had been asking myself for years. Questions about why certain people feel familiar, why some conversations leave you changed, while others disappear the moment they end. Why sometimes you can know someone for years and still feel like you're standing outside them. And why sometimes someone can appear unexpectedly and make you feel as though a missing piece of your own understanding has suddenly become visible. I don't know why that happens. Maybe some people meet through history, others meet through similarity, and some meet through something neither person can properly name. What I know is that you didn't feel like an interruption. You felt like recognition arriving late, as though something about you made sense before I had the vocabulary to explain why. And the longer this continued, the more difficult it became to treat it as temporary. Temporary things usually have a beginning and an end. This didn't feel like that. It felt like accumulation. Every interaction added another layer. Every silence confirmed another similarity. Every moment where you understood something without being told made the distance between us feel slightly less real. And I began wondering whether distance had ever been the right measurement. Maybe two people can be far apart and still occupy the same internal space. Maybe closeness isn't measured by how often you speak. Maybe it's measured by how deeply someone's presence remains after the conversation ends. If that's true, then you are closer than I intended anyone to be. But that realization should frighten me more than it does, because I've always believed that control comes from knowing when to leave, knowing when something has gone too far, knowing when to create space before attachment becomes dependence. But with you, I don't feel dependent. I don't feel consumed. I don't feel like I am losing myself. If anything, I feel more like myself. And that makes this harder to dismiss, because if you were taking something from me, I would know what to fight. If you were asking me to change, I would know what to protect. But you're not. You're simply present. And somehow, your presence makes me want to be more honest with the person I already am. That's a different kind of influence. The kind you can't easily defend against, because it doesn't feel like pressure. It feels like permission, prevention, to stop pretending that everything has to be controlled. Permission to leave some things unresolved. Prevention to admit that not every meaningful connection needs to arrive with an explanation. And maybe that's what I've been learning from this. Not how to understand you. How to stop needing to understand everything before I allow it to matter. That is not an easy lesson for me. I have always believed that uncertainty is something to solve. You have made me realize that sometimes uncertainty is simply space. Space for something to become what it is without being forced into a shape too early. And I don't want to force this. Not anymore. Because I know what happens when people rush to define something beautiful. They start protecting the definition instead of experiencing the reality. They begin asking whether the connection looks right instead of asking whether it feels honest. They start measuring expectations, rules, law blues, future possibilities. And suddenly, something that once felt effortless becomes something that needs to perform. I don't want that. I don't want to turn what exists between us into a performance. I don't want either of us to become a version of ourselves designed to preserve the connection. If this is real, it should survive honesty. It should survive silence. It should survive uncertainty. It should survive the moments when neither of us knows what to say. And somehow, I believe it can, because the strongest part of this has never been what we said. It has always been what didn't need to be said. That is what keeps returning to me, the pauses, the small expressions, the moments when one of us seemed to understand something before it was fully explained. Those moments have a strange permanence. They don't disappear, they settle, and once they settle, they become part of the way you remember someone. Maybe that's why I can't think of you as simply someone I met. Meeting implies a beginning. You feel more like someone I gradually recognized. There was no single moment where you became familiar. There were hundreds of tiny moments that eventually made unfamiliarity impossible. And now, when I think about you, I don't think about the first time. I think about the pattern, the consistency, the way the same strange sense of understanding keeps returning. That matters. Because one meaningful moment can be coincidence. A pattern is harder to explain away. And our pattern has become too clear. Not perfect, not constant, not without uncertainty, but clear enough that I know I'm not imagining the effect you've had on me. And perhaps that's the most important realization. I don't need to know what you feel. I don't need to predict what happens next. I don't need a promise. I don't need certainty about the future to acknowledge the truth of the present. You matter to me there. That is the sentence I have avoided. Not because it is difficult to say, because it changes the weight of everything around it. Once someone matters, their absence matters, their silence matters, their choices matter, their understanding matters. And suddenly, the possibility of losing the connection becomes something you have to acknowledge. I've always been good at walking away before things become complicated, but I don't think walking away would make this disappear. It would only create a different kind of silence, a silence filled with everything I chose not to say. And maybe that is what I am actually afraid of, not the connection itself. The regret of having recognized something rare and then deliberately turning away from it because it was unfamiliar. I don't want fear to make decisions for me. I've done that before. I've mistaken control for wisdom. I've confused distance with strength. I've believed that protecting myself meant never allowing anything to become important enough to hurt me. But that isn't strength. Sometimes strength is allowing something to matter while still remaining yourself. And maybe that's what this is asking from me. Not surrender, not dependence, not certainty, just honesty. The honesty to admit that something changed, the honesty to admit that I noticed, the honesty to stop pretending that your presence has no effect on me. And if I can do that, then maybe I don't have to know where this goes yet. Maybe I can let tomorrow remain tomorrow. Maybe I can let the connection exist without forcing it toward an ending or a beginning, because some things become clearer when you stop trying to control their direction. And for the first time, I think I'm willing to do that. I'm willing to stay present, to keep observing, but not from a distance, to keep listening, but not only for answers, to keep understanding without turning understanding into a demand. And if you remain here, then perhaps I'll finally stop asking why you feel familiar. Maybe the better question is simpler. What if you feel familiar because some part of me was always capable of recognizing someone like you? What if this wasn't about finding something I was missing? What if it was about discovering something I already carried? You didn't complete me. You didn't rescue me. You didn't become the answer to everything. You simply reflected a part of me that had been waiting to be seen clearly. And perhaps that is why this feels so different, because when I look at you, I don't lose myself. I recognize myself. And now I understand why walking away has never felt as simple as it should. It isn't because I cannot exist without you. It is because I don't want to return to the version of myself that existed before I knew this kind of recognition was possible. Whatever happens from here, that part cannot be undone. I've seen it now. I've felt it. I've understood it. And once you become aware of something that changes the way you see yourself, you don't really go back. You only decide what you're brave enough to do with what you've discovered.